Check, check, check. Check, check, check.
Thank you. Good morning. I am James Holzer, the chair of this committee and director of the National Archives and Records Administration's Office of Government Information Services. It's my pleasure this morning to welcome you to the National Archives and to introduce the 10th Archivist of the United States, David S. Ferriero.
Good morning, and welcome back. For those of you who have been with us before. So the National Archives established this committee in May of 2014. And while the creation of the committee was a result of a commitment in the second United States Open Government National Action Plan, the overreaching goal of this committee to increase access to our nation's vital records mirror those of the National Archives. Is an agency dedicated to driving openness, cultivating public participation, and strengthening open government by promoting access to federal records. The National Archives is proud to have provided a home for this committee. I know you have a full agenda for this meeting, but before you begin, I want to thank the staff of the Office of Government Information Services for their hard work in administering this committee over the last 2 years. And at this point, I'd like to hand the program over to James Holzer, the director.
As part of the Open Government Partnership, the United States issued its second Open Government National Action Plan on December 5th, 2013, setting forth ambitious commitments to advance open government in the subsequent years. These commitments included this committee, which the National Archives established in May 2014 to improve FOIA administration through the collaborative efforts of both requesters and federal agencies. As an agency dedicated to driving openness, cultivating public participation, and strengthening open government by promoting access to federal records, the Archives is a natural home for this committee. I want to thank the Archivist of the United States for his leadership and commitment to open government and working to extend the committee's charter for another 2 years. As the committee's 2014-2016 term ends, I want to thank our committee members for their time and service and their commitment to improving FOIA administration across the executive branch. I would also like to thank the members of the public who attended and participated in our open meetings and submitted comments. Next, we will spend a few minutes introducing the committee members who are around the table and participating in the meeting via telephone. During the course of this meeting, for the record, please identify yourself by name and affiliation when you speak. We will begin with the members we expect to have on the telephone. I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves and remind the group of your profession. Dave Barr.
Good morning. My name is Dave Barr, and I'm an attorney in private practice, and I represent the requester community in matters, public records matters all around the country.
Thank you. Andrew Becker. Okay. Eric Gillespie. Ann Wiseman.
Good morning. This is Ann Wiseman. I'm the Executive Director of Campaign for Accountability and also a FOIA requester.
Thank you. Now let's hear from those of you in the room. Please introduce yourselves and remind the group where you work. We're going to start with the table with Mark.
Mark Snake, I'm a private practitioner here in the district, longtime FOIA user and litigator, and the executive director of the James Madison Project.
Melanie Pastay, the Director of the Office of Information Policy at the Department of Justice.
Nate Jones, Director of the Freedom of Information Act project at National Security Archive.
And I'm Brent Tevitt. I'm the Deputy General Counsel for Mission Services, Science and Technology at the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Hi, I'm Maggie Mulvihill, and I teach data journalism at Boston University, and I'm an attorney and frequent requester.
And I'm Larry Gottesman with the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm the Chief of the FOIA and Privacy Branch.
Okay, we'll start with Karen Finnegan.
Hi, I'm Karen Finnegan-Myers, formerly with the State Department. Now I'm with the Department of Defense, the Director of Executive Services Directorate.
I'm Jim Hogan. I'm with the Directorate for Oversight and Compliance, Department of Defense.
Sean Moulton, Open Government Program Manager at the Project on Government Oversight.
Good morning, Martin Michalowski. I'm the Deputy Chief Administrator Officer for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Lee White, Executive Director of the National Coalition for History.
I'm David Pritzker, Deputy General Counsel of the Administrative Conference of the United States. We're a small federal agency that's structured by statute as a public-private partnership for good government.
I'm Clay Johnson. I'm the founder of the Department of Better Technology, which is not a small federal agency.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, let me also introduce OGIS's facilitator, Krista Lemlin, who serves as the committee's designated federal officer. So before we hear from our subcommittees, I want to review our general agenda, set out the basic expectations for our meeting, and provide you with information concerning the committee's 2016-2018 term. Under the terms of our current charter, this is our last meeting. We anticipate the charter's renewal, though, in May. We recently published a Federal Register notice and an OGIS blog post announcing that NARA seeks nominations for individuals interested in serving a 2-year appointment on the FOIA Advisory Committee. NARA seeks committee members who represent a wide range of views and interests, including large and small federal agencies, requesters from different categories, including historians, journalists, academics, and nonprofit organizations that advocate on FOIA issues. Self-nominations are welcome, and current committee members are not only may they are encouraged to reapply. So to reapply, review the instructions in the Federal Register or the OGIS blog post, and by April 30th, 2016, please provide the following information: the nominee's name, title, and relevant contact information. a short paragraph about the nominee, summarizing the nominee's background and experience, or otherwise highlighting the contributions the individual would bring to the committee, and also a resume. The 2016-2018 committee will have 4 meetings per year. Once we schedule meeting dates for the committee's next term, we will make that information publicly available on our website and through our blog. At the new committee's first meeting, committee members will discuss and create subcommittees to address FOIA topics of interest to the committee. The committee-designated federal officer, Krista Lemlin, will be passing the DFO torch to Kate Gassner as the new DFO for the committee's 2016-2018 term. So stay up to date on the latest OGIS and FOIA Advisory Committee news, activities, and events by visiting our website at www.ogis.archives.gov, our blog at foia.blogs.archives.gov, and on Twitter at FOIA_ombuds. So we will take a 10-minute break around 11:15, and during the break you may wish to purchase food or drink from the Charters Cafe, which is located 2 levels down on the ground floor, which is also where the restrooms are located. So we have allotted time at the end of each subcommittee presentation for public comments. So it's a slight departure. It will be after each report. At these times, we look forward to hearing from non-committee members who wish to comment. We also welcome anyone to submit written comments to the committee at any time. So I would like now to turn our attention to the approval of our January 19, 2016 meeting minutes. The committee members have had a chance to review a copy of the January 2016 meeting minutes, and I believe there's a copy in your folders as well. Melanie Puste submitted minor edits to the meeting minutes, and I'd like to know if there are any additional revisions to the minutes. Okay? If there are no additional revisions, I will now entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Do we have a motion? Thank you. Do we have a second? I'll second. Thank you. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? All right, the minutes are approved. So next, for the proactive disclosure portion of today's meeting, I'd like to turn the floor over to our guest speaker, Margaret B. Kwakwa, Assistant Professor at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Professor Kwakwa will present her study of the commercial use of FOIA and proactive disclosures as a public benefit and potential cost-saving measure for agencies. Professor Kwakwa is a graduate of Brown University and Northeastern University School of Law and a former education volunteer with the Peace Corps. Her research and teaching interests center on civil procedure and procedural justice, administrative law, and judicial review of agency actions, federal court litigation, and government transparency. Her articles have appeared or will appear in the Duke Law Journal, the Boston University Law Review, UC Davis Law Review, Boston College Law Review, Maryland Law Review, American University Law Review, and Harvard Journal on Legislation, among others. The Society of American Law Teachers selected Professor Kwakwa as the inaugural winner of a Junior Faculty Teaching Award, and the New York Times recently featured her work. On a personal level, I've had an opportunity to hear the presentation. We had her come speak at OGIS, and I'm very excited to have her come in and give her presentation to you guys. Professor Kwakwa, the floor is yours.
I want to thank OGIS Director James Holzer and Assistant Director Amy Bennett for inviting me to present my recent research findings to you today. And particularly in this 50th anniversary year of FOIA's original enactment, I know there's a palpable excitement about the possible FOIA reforms, and so it's an especially great honor to be able to join you to talk about my work. So in my remarks, I'm going to try to highlight some of the key findings in my study, the final version of which just became available in the Duke Law Journal. And I'll also detail some recommendations that I have based on those findings. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion, but I'd welcome questions or comments at any point in my presentation. So what prompted my work in this project was a combination of 2 observations that will sound familiar to you. One is that journalists and the news media sort of have a constant low-level complaint about how FOIA simply isn't very useful in many instances in reporting the news, even though journalists were the prime intended users of the law. And then the other was that despite the kind of loud complaints about FOIA's failings, as we all know, the federal government's now receiving over 700,000 requests a year. And so it must be serving someone's interests at least well enough to keep them coming back for more. And so in this paper, I'm looking at one set, only one, but one set of frequent FOIA users, and those are commercial requesters who use FOIA as part of their profit-making enterprise. And particularly in this anniversary year for FOIA, I think it can be helpful to contextualize some of my findings by examining the impetus for the law as originally conceived. When I say that the news media was the intended beneficiary of FOIA, it may even be more fair to say that they were intimately involved in drafting the law. In 1953, Harold Cross wrote a book called The People's Right to Know in his capacity as an advisor to the American Society of Newspaper Editors, a prominent journalism organization at the time. And after documenting the patchwork of existing access laws at that time, most of which fell woefully short of journalists' needs, Cross called on Congress to legislate a right to access public records at the federal level. And the book garnered interest in Congress. Cross himself subsequently became the legal advisor to the special subcommittee in the House of Representatives tasked with drafting the law, which of course Representative Moss chaired. And journalists, in fact, mostly staffed the subcommittee. So journalists were crafting the very contours of the law, not just its vision. But the vision was equally important to Congress. So this is a vision, of course, with which we are all very familiar. The whole idea of public records access designed for journalists was that the news media could use the law to inform the public about government activities and thereby enhance the public's ability to participate in democratic governance and hold elected officials accountable. And the legislative history of FOIA is replete with references for the need to have an informed electorate as vital to a democratic society. The reality today, though, is that news media make up a tiny fraction of requesters, in the single-digit percentages at most agencies. Journalists find the law slow in operation and the fight for access to be resource-intensive. They simply don't have the time or legal budgets to take full advantage. But we do have some requesters who do have the time in the budget, and those include the requesters that I studied, which are commercial requesters. And I think prior to my work, I think there's been kind of only anecdotal or sometimes numerical, but not much more understanding of commercial requesters and how they're operating. And so I really sought to do an in-depth study of what types of commercial interests are served under the law. And so to that end, sorry, it seems to be slightly cut off, but to that end, I conducted case studies of particular agencies with significant numbers of commercial requesters whose data on FOIA I obtained by filing my own FOIA requests. And the agencies that I ended up studying for various reasons were the SEC, the FDA, EPA, the Defense Logistics Agency, the FTC, and the NIH. And at each of these agencies, the amount of commercial requesting is very significant. So that's represented in green on this slide. And in fact, at 4 of the 6 agencies, commercial requesters are a majority of requesters, and at some, an overwhelming majority. So these agencies, starting on the left, are the SEC with 69% commercial requesting, FDA with 75%, EPA at 79%, and the Defense Logistics Agency at 96%. But more than just the numbers, my study of agency data was designed to reveal exactly how businesses are using FOIA. And as I describe in the paper, there's a large range of uses. And let me be clear from the outset that none of these uses are in any way illegitimate, much less unlawful. In fact, it's entirely likely that some fraction of commercial requests do advance FOIA's underlying democratic goals. But my study does show that commercial interests, largely, by and large, are also advancing pretty strong private interests rather than promoting the public's knowledge about governance. So, for example, businesses use FOIA to get information about their competitors. Lawyers use FOIA both to get information useful to their current clients, but also in potentially recruiting clients or case development. So think about, potential drug or medical device claims and FDA requesting. Businesses use FOIA to get information that they then feed into various other services that they provide, such as consulting or advising or publishing ventures. Companies that provide due diligence services are another big group of frequent commercial requesters. So for example, at EPA, almost all of the most frequent commercial requesters are companies that evaluate environmental risks for business clients prior to real estate transactions. Likewise, at SEC, many of the most frequent requesters are due diligence firms that provide reports prior to certain types of business deals, like initial public offerings, mergers and acquisitions, and things such as that. And they're seeking information that might suggest a regulatory risk or an investigation of the target company. And then finally, there is a group of frequent commercial requesters that most interested and in some ways surprised me. And that was the proliferation of a category of businesses that I classify as information resellers. So these are businesses who request large volumes of records from the federal government and resell them, sometimes at considerable profit, to private parties. So let me provide a few examples. At FDA, the single highest volume requester is a company called FOI Services, Inc., which submitted 571 requests in 2013. In turn, its sole business model is to request under FOIA FDA records and resell them. It maintains a database, individual records within which can be purchased. It also offers services of making custom FOIA requests. Another company that does the same thing, somewhat misleadingly named, is called FDA News. It maintains a library of FDA Form 483s, which are facilities inspection reports. And it sells access to that database for an annual subscription of nearly $1,000 or individual reports for more than $100 each. And it obtains those reports, those facilities inspection reports, by submitting hundreds of FOIA requests a year. Washington Information Source essentially does the same. It has an access of inspection records that includes those reports and other documents which it requests en masse under FOIA. And these three information resellers at FDA are not alone. Resellers are present amongst top requesters at 5 of the 6 agencies that I studied. And at 2 agencies, FDA being one of them and SEC being the other, multiple resellers compete against one another. So here are some other examples. The biggest commercial requester at NIH is the FOIA Group, which is an information reseller that makes custom requests on behalf of clients. One of the biggest commercial requesters at the Defense Logistics Agency is a company called Day & Day, which is an information reseller that maintains various databases of defense contracts and bids for those contracts, access to which costs $1,800 a year. And at the SEC, one of the biggest requesters is Bioscience Advisors, which maintains a database of licensing and development contracts that have been filed with the SEC, an annual subscription to which is nearly $10,000. Another is Royalty Stat, which competes for largely the same market with Bioscience Advisors, markets various database products, including a licensing agreement database, which it advertises comes from the SEC filings it requests under FOIA. Even SEC's biggest requester, SEC Probes, which at the time was classified as a news media requester, should probably be considered a commercial reseller, as it maintains a database of SEC investigation materials that its founder has been collecting and reselling under other business auspices for years. At the time of the study, access to the materials they had on this version of his website was free, and so I think it was classified as news media. Now access is charged at thousands of dollars a year. But as an aside, if this one requester was reclassified, it would put the SEC at 89% commercial requesting rather than 79 and only 3% news media. And at EPA, there's also a reseller amongst the top requesters. EDR Inc. is a company that offers, in its words, a comprehensive look at current government environmental filings. And its database collection is evident in its FOIA requests. It requests entire categories of records rather than records about, say, a specific property like the other commercial requesters do at EPA. So resellers have cropped up at nearly all of these agencies to fill various kind of a wide variety of niches of information needs amongst the private market. And based on the kind of various commercial requesting practices that this study has documented, I want to talk a little bit about the implications of commercial requesting for FOIA more broadly, in my view. So one implication is that I think we can look at my data and infer that government is in some way implicitly or sometimes explicitly subsidizing corporate requesting. So my data suggests that agencies are often recouping only between about 1% and 5% of the cost that they incur processing commercial requests by charging those commercial requesters fees. And the numbers are not that small, right? So at FDA, for example, they spent about $33 million in 1 year on FOIA processing. We can't disaggregate that cost by request, but if we know that about 3/4 of their requests come from commercial requesters, then we would assume about 3/4 of those costs, about $26 million, would be attributable to commercial requesters. By contrast, in that fiscal year, it recouped only $327,000 in fees from commercial requesters in particular. And as we saw, some of these commercial requesters are making significant profits off of the government's giveaway of essentially free or low-cost federal records, which I think makes it a sort of unintended corporate subsidy. Now, we have subsidies all over the private marketplace. Many of them are justified because we have kind of a public good attached to it. Familiar subsidies that create urban renewal or jobs or something like that. But in the case of commercial use of FOIA, I think that my study demonstrates the overwhelming objective of commercial users is fueling private profits and not, in particular, the public interest that Congress had in mind. And in particular, companies often profit from these records specifically because the requester closely guards the information obtained. It's not a vehicle for dissemination to the public about what government is doing. So, for example, commercial requesters using FOIA for due diligence services are only able to profit from that information precisely because it's not widely available. Even more so, right, resellers can only profit from federal records because they guard those records closely and charge high access fees. And so in this way, I think the free and low-cost provision of federal records is subsidizing essentially corporate secret keeping and not the democracy-enhancing mission of FOIA to a large degree. Second, I think the volume of commercial requesting suggests that at least at some agencies, news media and other requesters may be crowded out due to resource constraints. At bigger agencies that I studied, some individual commercial requesters, like a single requester, are filing hundreds and even sometimes thousands of requests a year. There's one requester at the SEC that averages a request an hour for every business day of the calendar year. And so given that delay and administrative burden are frequently cited reasons that the news media doesn't use FOIA more, and given that some agencies, we know their average response times are well exceeding our 20-day statutory limit, business day statutory deadline for responses, it seems entirely likely that resources used to fill commercial requesters' requests are taking away from those resources available to be used for requests that might better serve FOIA's core mission. And then third, information resellers end up in some industries becoming the actual locus for access to federal records for whole sectors in the private market, which I think risks privatizing, sort of a de facto privatizing of some of the transparency function itself. And there's two main reasons why companies often prefer to go to resellers rather than make their own FOIA requests at a fraction of the price. The first is that it protects their identity. So if a business files a FOIA request, their identity and the records they request will become part of the agency's FOIA logs, which themselves are generally available under FOIA. So a company may not want that information to become public. A second reason is that these resellers warehouse information and can make it immediately available for a fee. And so the delay and administrative burden of using FOIA is itself a reason that businesses use resellers instead. But as the reseller becomes the actual locus of access to federal records, I think we risk giving that reseller the power to decide, for example, that certain records aren't worth pursuing, and those records may end up hidden in government files from all of the truly interested parties who use the reseller rather than the agency as a source of government information. I don't want, however, my conclusions about these various potential problems to suggest that I don't think businesses have legitimate information needs or that they shouldn't be entitled to access government information. On the contrary, I simply think that FOIA wasn't designed for this purpose and in fact is poorly suited to serve it. And one of the most interesting findings in the FOIA logs that I studied, for me at least, was that as it turns out, commercial requesters tend to request the same types of records over and over and over again. This is true both of sort of regular commercial requesters and also the subset that I identified as information resellers. So, for example, at FDA, this is a snapshot of requests from a typical commercial requester, INC Research, and you can see the subject matter of its requests in the last column on the right. So over and over and over again, INC Research requests Form 483s and other inspection-related records. Obviously, each particular request concerns a different facility and inspection that took place, but the type of record that it requests is routine. Here's another great example. At FDA, there's actually a group of commercial requesters who do nothing but request the FOIA logs themselves or portions of them. So J.H. Barr is one such requester, and you can see that all of its requests are simply for different time chunks of the FOIA logs. And incidentally, there's some evidence suggesting that requesting the FOIA logs is a way of seeing what other people are requesting about you or your client. So this is, these kinds of repetitive requests are typical of commercial requesters. In contrast to commercial requesters, if we look at news media requests, they vary widely in subject matter. So also at FDA, this is an example, Bloomberg News, a snapshot of their requests. You can see the subject matter of their requests varies from cybersecurity threats to correspondence between senior FDA officials to results of a survey. Right, so the subject matter is all over the map. And this same pattern holds true at other agencies. So here's a list of the, requests made by a top requester at the DLA. The SP numbers you see on the right are solicitation numbers for bids for particular defense contracts. Essentially, all of the commercial requesters are asking for bid information regarding those contracts. This is a list of requests from Bioscience Advisors, one of SEC's resellers, where you can see that all of the requests are for exhibits to required SEC filings. So given that commercial FOIA users have information needs that are very routine, one-by-one FOIA requesting, in my view, is a highly inefficient way of meeting those needs. And by contrast, the varied news media requests may demonstrate the value of the one-by-one FOIA requesting model as the best way to serve journalists' interests in reporting the news. So to address the fact that FOIA is, in my view, poorly suited to meet these commercial information needs, and in line with many of our recent transparency initiatives, I propose a relatively targeted but aggressive affirmative disclosure regime. And under this regime, agencies would be incentivized to, or perhaps even required to, identify routinely requested categories of records in their FOIA logs and disclose those whole categories by publishing searchable, downloadable index databases of those records. This differs from the current regime. I'm using this example up here from FDA. It differs from the current regime under which agencies only have to affirmatively disclose frequently requested records once they are actually requested, and only when the particular record requested is likely to be subject to subsequent requests. So under my proposal, for example, FDA would identify not a particular inspection record that is going to be the subject of frequent requests, but rather that inspection records generally are the subject of repeated requests and would make that a target of affirmative disclosure, and publish those records proactively without waiting for requests to be received. So as to some of the examples that I cite in my paper, the data also support the notion that routine disclosure is likely to be possible. So these very inspection-related records made up almost 2,000 of FDA's 10,000 requests in this year. And of those 2,000 that were fully processed, there's actually 1,978 requests processed. A full 93% of them were released in full. An even easier example is found with the hundreds of requests made at FDA for the FDA's own FOIA logs, all of which are released in full. So this type of affirmative disclosure should certainly be paired with other affirmative disclosure efforts already ongoing, such as FOIA Online. And I think any important component of an affirmative disclosure regime is focusing on appropriate technology, including application program interface, to make data compatible with private parties' need to reasonably access and use it. I also think it would be particularly helpful to have the Office of E-Government and Information Technology assist in the creation of online databases to make them most useful and efficient in publication. Certainly, there's nothing stopping agencies from taking this approach on their own under the current system. But I also think there are several mechanisms through which agencies might be encouraged or required to take these kinds of steps. So the strongest form of implementation, of course, would have to come, I think, from some sort of mandate, either from Congress through legislation or a presidential mandate through an executive order. Either one could require agencies to undertake, say, an annual review of their FOIA logs to look for opportunities in this regard, to publish whole categories of frequently requested records. The requirement could also be enforced potentially through some sort of OMB review process for approval of the agency's decisions in that regard, and or even through a private cause of action for agencies in noncompliance. Short of a mandate, though, I think agencies can also be encouraged and incentivized to take these sorts of steps. So the Department of Justice's Office of Information Policy, for example, which could, of course, which issues all sorts of important policy guidance on FOIA, but could issue guidance to this regard and advise agencies to undertake these sorts of steps. Maybe even more relevant here to this audience, OGIS, of course, could also issue advice and best practices to agencies and make this part of its agenda. I think agencies could also be further incentivized by having to report affirmative disclosure initiatives like this as part of their annual FOIA reports to the Department of Justice. So in my view, there's a variety of potential benefits of an affirmative disclosure regime of the type that I am proposing. So for the agencies, I certainly don't want to minimize the fact that this kind of initiative would cost money. It would also save them on the back end from having to respond to thousands of one-by-one individual requests in their current FOIA operations, and I think to the tune of potentially millions of dollars at some agencies. It would also have the secondary effect of freeing up the FOIA personnel at those agencies to potentially serve the requests that go more to the heart of FOIA more quickly, and might make FOIA faster and more useful for journalists and watchdog groups. It would also kind of take back this public function and eliminate a private subsidy. Once these records are published for the world to see, information resellers who do nothing more than warehouse free or low-cost federal records and sell them at a profit would no longer be able to trade in what should be public commodities. And I have up here a telling statement made by one of the information resellers to the New York Times in response to my research proposal, the day-and-day vice president, that says, a good part of our business would go away, and thus he thinks this is a bad idea. But I'm actually not even convinced that this is a bad move for the business community writ large, maybe this particular business model. But in many ways, I think it would level the playing field for private enterprise, potentially promote more fair competition, possibly help small businesses that otherwise don't have the resources to afford to purchase public information from private companies. I think it would also force resellers like Day and Day and others to add more value to their services by bringing to bear their expertise, and might push innovation in those areas. So publishing databases of these kinds of records, I think, lays the groundwork for all sorts of unanticipated benefits, including from researchers or news media who might find uses for the data in the production of knowledge or citizen engagement. And of course, once the agency has gone to the trouble, as they're currently doing, of searching for and reviewing and making ready to distribute these records, I think we should all hope that the public can reap the maximum possible benefit from the agency's efforts. So with that, I will stop and look forward to your questions and discussion.
All right. I think we're going to get you a water. Okay. Thank you for joining us to present your fascinating research and findings. And now I'd like to open the floor to the committee. And does anyone have any questions or feedback?
I want to thank you. It was really interesting. And of course, we're at OIP, we issued guidance about a year ago, specifically on proactive disclosures and the whole idea of not just releasing frequently requested, not waiting for 3 requests for the exact same thing, but to look for opportunities, exactly the things you're talking about, the type of thing, the type of document that's routinely requested are perfect candidates for agencies to just change their whole dynamic from the get-go and make them available proactively. I think that one thing that was really striking was the sense I always have gotten from agencies is that the reason they don't do that, or the difficulties, or one of the challenges in doing that, is the idea of processing the records for release. So that if you spend all this time processing records, especially records that have exemption 4 considerations, you have to give notice to the submitter, there's a whole process, then that delays you from responding to other requests. But what struck me was that you had that statistic from FDA where a lot of the reports were released in full. Now, I don't know if they're released in full after submitter notice. That would be my one question. I don't know if you know that.
My guess is yes, though I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
And one other thing that actually the New York Times reporter who wrote that story spoke to someone at FDA about that very question. It didn't make it into the article, but about whether the forms that are being requested could even be designed at the front end to be checked when they're created.
Exactly.
Right? So then the check would happen at the front end as part of the same process, and then upload to the database would be one immediate subsequent step.
Right.
And so for whatever small percentage of forms have those concerns, that could be dealt with at the front end. Right. That suggestion was made. I think the FOIA officer that the reporter talked to said, something like, yeah, that's a great idea. I'm not quite sure why we don't do that, but I understand that there's, a lot of bureaucracy between here and that kind of, that kind of step. So I think that's the kind of the way that we could think about solving those problems.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
That was really good. So, yeah, I would like to nominate Margaret Quokka to serve on this committee immediately. The one thing, just a piece of feedback, is I was the director of Sunlight Labs for a long time at the Sunlight Foundation, and now I find myself a technology vendor to government, in part because I came to the conclusion that government can only be as transparent as its technology vendors will allow for it to be, which is sad and depressing. But, I brought forward to this committee at the beginning of, at its inception, hey, why don't we take a look at the technology behind FOIA? The committee decided to go in different directions, which is fine and expected. But I wonder if the ideas of proactive disclosure are being held back in some way by government's failure to acknowledge the existence of the internet, which it invented.
I think you're absolutely right that technology constraints play a big role. And even when agencies are contracting with vendors, say, to run their FOIA operations and things like that. Sometimes the agencies have handed off enough that they don't have as much access or knowledge about how to use the systems that are in place as you might hope. That's actually been one of the complaints that I've heard about what I think of as a very successful first step, right? FOIA Online, is that the tech, and I don't do technology, but I actually was trying to get data from FOIA Online and had to hire someone to write code to scrape the website because you can't download it en masse, right? So, that's just a tiny example of the kinds of technology barriers. Everything's up there, but it's still not actually reasonably accessible from a technology perspective. And so I think that's a really critical component. And to the extent that, we now have, I think, some more government resources going into technology, I think that's a really important point moving forward. I'm not sure what the best mechanism for improving that is, but I share your concern.
Also, you did a public service, I think, by doing this study. And as a journalist, I'm ashamed that we make up such a small fraction of federal requesters. So this will inflame the journalism community, as it should. I had two questions. One is, do you have an aggregate number of the profit margin for these companies? And are they private companies? So that we can get that information from their filings. And number two, we at the local level are scraping a lot of local government websites. So is that something you foresee these companies doing? It doesn't sound like they're doing a lot of scraping now, but is that on the horizon?
Three things. I certainly don't mean to shame journalists. While they might be using FOIA in smaller numbers, I think they've still had some amazing successes under FOIA, and we've seen a lot of really, truly amazing reporting that's coming out of FOIA. And so I think we may be getting a lot of bang for our buck on each individual request on the journalist side, even if the numbers are smaller than we wish. On the profits question, but obviously I wish it were working better for them, right? On the profits question, the short answer is no. I haven't found a way to access any profits numbers off of these companies. Many of them have, one small niche, and if you look at their kind of websites, they look, relatively rudimentary. They're serving a very, specialized information need regarding that agency. I'm actually not sure if any of them are public. I think that they are, at least by and large, private companies. So I'm not sure that there would be relevant public filings to figure that out. But it's a great question and something that is definitely worth looking at. And on the local level, the short answer is you may know much more than I do. I really didn't focus on, state and local records access or the kind of role that private enterprise might be playing in, kind of gathering or mediating access to government information at that level. I suspect for all of the same reasons that there are companies that have cropped up to do those very services, but it was not something that I reached out into in this particular work. So I think it's certainly a component of what's going on. I think to the extent that we have technology problems at the federal level, right? Mm-hmm. Right. I think when we're looking at state and local governments, it's only magnified. And so, and the uneven application of state and local access laws, I think, is probably contributes to a gap that I imagine private enterprise would be able to serve.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So a question and a larger point. The question is, during your research, did you come across any discussion or discussion about this issue of 508 compliance, which is part of the Rehabilitation Act, which means that there's a law that anything posted online needs to be readable in a text format. So often, as our subcommittee and others have said, FOIA guys, you do all this great work finding the documents, reviewing the documents, sending the documents out in mail. Do one more last step and post all of them online automatically. It'd be great if a vendor could do that. Often we hear, no, 508 compliance means this is too difficult. We're not going to tackle that. So that's my question. My comment is, despite this, the good news is that we have seen some sites online, like FOIA Online, like the State Department's excellent reading room, that post not even these subsets, but I think all releases online. And I agree with you very much that it would be very beneficial to find a way to get these subsets online. But I would say that we maybe use that as a pilot program. The next step is working with the way quarterly is fine. There can be a delay to take the next step and post all docs online, because it doesn't make sense to spend all this money and not do the one more step of putting it on the internet. So my question is, do you have a solution to tackle this 508 issue?
No.
So that's our job.
Yes, I've run across that same pushback in various venues. I don't want to minimize that issue as an issue. Certainly, we appear in there are some examples where we're getting past it. So, I'm hoping that those will encourage agencies to see how to more efficiently meet those requirements. And I think, FOIA Online and the State Department, those are great examples. And just, I think you're absolutely right. We should take that very last step and publish everything. But even more so, right, in some of these instances, we should take these out of the FOIA queue entirely, right? And I think if we meet these information needs more head on, we'll be better off both in the business community and in the requester community.
What a great segue. As you said, EPA, about 80% of requests are site-specific. We come up with a little slightly different numbers, but we find the same thing. Most of our requests are site-specific. We're about to launch work on My Property 2.0, which will eliminate those requests totally. So we're about to make these databases available to people where they can actually not only search, but also get certificates of conformity or non-conformity. So we're sort of looking toward that. We're not quite there yet. We're close, but stay tuned. Probably next couple of months it'll be there.
That's exciting to hear.
Exactly, like for me, can I get rid of 80%, 40 or 50% or 80% of my requests? It makes life really easy for us all. So
absolutely,
we're looking for technology. And what is scraping a website? No, I'm just kidding. Sounds scary.
Someone did it for me.
So very helpful information,
thank you.
For sure, and thank you for that. I think the next step we need to have, and this is going to have to come from the government agencies, we really got to dive down deeper into what you were able to glean as a private citizen getting access from the government. So while I think most of us are probably annoyed and incensed, whatever range of feelings you want to do when you see private companies coming in and making profits off of what FOIA was not intended to be used for, at the same time, the fact of the matter is they're exploiting the way the law is written. And to some extent, or maybe to full extent, I mean, our job, or any of those of us who want to reform FOIA, our mission's not to punish or influence how the private companies are doing their business. It's to make sure that the law itself is in such a way that is doing what we thought and hoped it was intended to do. And in some level, I'll play a little devil's advocate against our own requester community. I mean, it shows the short-sightedness of not being able to see the forest through the trees. Because one of the things that benefited these companies by doing this was how the fee provisions were changed. That if an agency couldn't respond within a certain amount of time, the agencies can't charge them fees. And it sounded great from the requester community because it would help us do what we wanted to do. Well, this is what happened as a result. So these guys are just doing what the law permits them to do, sort of the same way the CIA Information Act backfired on the ACLU's lobbying back in the 1980s. It hasn't worked out well at all. But the next level that we need to get at for the data, so for example, the 483 reports, and I have no idea because I don't usually deal with these particular agencies. I'd love to see the same type of data at DOD, state, the intelligence communities, and those of you from those agencies, maybe you have some raw data to understand that, because the agencies that I deal with all the time, which have incredibly lengthy delays of time, years. I mean, I still get responses from the CIA from 17 years ago that I put in requests. I'd love to know if commercial requesters are in any way delaying that. I don't know, because I haven't done that type of research. But 483 reports, are there, and I don't expect you to know this because it probably has to come from the agency. But so clearly you look at all those, the data that you had, they're asking for site specifics, and we're talking about proactive disclosure, which we talked about our first meeting, that this is something that we're very interested in. How many, if they did proactively disclose all 483 reports, how many is that? I'll make up numbers because I have no idea. If there were 500 requested, but there's actually 22,000 of them, that might not be a good thing for for us to force the agency to proactively disclose that. Same thing with those requests that were released in full. What we need to know, because they are released in full, I assume the FOIA officers get a sense of what they can and cannot release, and it becomes very pro forma. Okay, this is going to be released in full. We can just push it to the side. So there's not a lot of time spent on that document. So is that really taking time away? We just don't know. So we'd have to look. In DLA at 96%, I mean, that seems pathetic on the surface that a private company is dominating. But I guess nobody really is interested in what the heck DLA is doing. If the reporters aren't submitting requests or anybody else. So what would be interesting to see for that is that a relatively new phenomenon? What was it 10 years ago? It was 50%. And there were a lot of journalists requesting, or academics, and as the law changed and the commercial requesters started dominating it, they gave up. You know, maybe go back to some requesters from back in that day and see, you know, you used to request a lot, ABC News, now you don't. Why is it? Well, because we never got our requests processed in time, and they didn't know why, but now we would because of your research. So that would be really helpful. But it's one of those things that I think we need to look in tandem with the government, because we got to get the data behind the scenes to see what really makes sense. Because I get concerned every time when we in the community, and I obviously want openness as much as possible, are pushing for things without understanding the full facts of the consequences. Because there's been too many amendments over the years where the consequences, I think, ended up biting us in the rear, whereas we thought it would be very helpful, and it wasn't. I mean, maybe we create a separate part of a FOIA office to only deal with commercial requests where there's significant fees assessed on those commercial requesters. And that way it's not taking away from those of us who are trying to get nonprofit records, journalistic records, and et cetera.
So I guess I share many of your intuitions about the unanswered questions, many of which I tried to find answers to and came up somewhat short in terms of what I can access. I suspect that the delays I have no, I'm not reporting something, but I suspect that the delays at intelligence agencies that you're describing are mostly due to other problems in terms of the review process, all right, and exempt information. That's my gut intuition, and I think that delays at other agencies may be due to other things going on. I'm working on a subsequent study right now about individuals who use FOIA kind of in lieu of administrative discovery, so think actually like DHS and immigrants and removal proceedings, et cetera. And so, which I think is, you know, information that they should have. Is FOIA the way we should be doing it, or is really the question? And so I think there may be different kind of topical problems going on at different agencies, and so I really did try to focus on agencies where, and I think this is largely true at these kind of big regulatory agencies, right, where commercial requests and commercial interests have kind of elevated to this level where we might be worried about the crowding out and resource constraints. You know, the question about, you know, if we say, well, you have to release all 483s, how many are there? I tried to figure out and failed. You know, I got the sense from trying to talk to some of the resellers that they were trying to be pretty comprehensive about it. So my gut tells me that they're getting a lot of it, but I couldn't get confirmation from the agency, at least not in the time frame that I was looking for an answer. And then on your last point on fees, could we kind of divert commercial requesters to a separate office or a separate track that involved kind of a separate fee structure? I certainly think it's worth thinking about all those proposals. I fear that to the extent that we burden commercial requesters too much, that it becomes a true burden, that will invite some sort of gamesmanship about whose name is on the request, et cetera, and agencies will spend more time trying to adjudicate who the real interested party is in a particular request and will add to the administrative burden. I'm thinking of, we have, the Supreme Court in Taylor versus Sturgill, right? It couldn't decide that these two requesters were actually working, as an agent for one another. And that's the kind of thing that if the courts can't figure it out, are the agencies going to be able to do that for thousands of requests? So I worry about making it too burdensome only because I think there might be consequences on that side too. But I think it's definitely worth thinking about.
Thank you very much. It was a terrific presentation. I did want to say, I think what we touched on earlier is the real challenge, is not just trying to get these things back or review them so that they can be released, but going back to the document creation, which is unfortunately outside of the FOIA office's real control. These are program offices, these are procurement officers, maybe multiple offices that are creating these. And so it becomes a big challenge, and I don't mean to dismiss that, but I do think that if we start to identify the records where we're going to get the most benefit for, like Larry has at EPA, and he's been working on the property records. He released the 1.0 of the My Property and saw a drop in your FOIA requests, and now being able to get the certifications, you're definitely going to see a huge drop again. And I think, Nate's point about 508 compliance, again, if we go back and we, give birth to these records in a different way, so they are automatically 508 compliant, that's a much easier hurdle to get over than to make a document that was not made that way suddenly 508 compliant and releasing it to everyone. And so, this raises some big issues, but I think it also underscores how we and FOIA offices themselves have to become advocates inside a broader process inside agencies.
I couldn't agree more, yeah. And I think, one component of that that I think is worth mentioning is that the way that we report FOIA office performance right now, right, is really about how many requests are processed, how quickly they're processed, how they get through them, right, what the dispositions are. And so without assigning any sort of, motive, the natural bureaucratic tendency, right, is to simply try to do that as well as possible because that's what you're being measured on, right? Whereas if somehow we were able to incorporate into annual FOIA reports or our accountability mechanisms for FOIA offices, these kinds of initiatives, I think, and reward them accordingly, right? That would kind of create a structure where FOIA officers might, feel more invested in that process rather than trying to meet the metrics they're currently being judged on.
Any more comments from the committee?
Could I make a comment?
Yes, sir, of course.
Based on your comment? Sure. And this is just talking off the top of my head, but as the person responsible for the records creation process, it's interesting for me to think about at the creation point as we're scheduling records, creating record schedules, we identify in advance those records that we anticipate are going to fall into this category, and we plan for that from the very beginning. So this is something I'm going to take to our records folks.
World who are developing these software tools,
yes, right,
that really need to build it into the systems. I mean, we can do whatever we want, we can do whatever we can do, but if the tools don't have the functionality, the capability built in, it makes it much more difficult.
Exactly.
Which was the earlier technology point. can only be as transparent as the technology allows you to be.
So, I mean, I think that it's evident why I love this presentation so much. It really kind of changed my mindset coming from a larger agency to OGIS. And I'd always seen commercial requesters as not being a problem, really. Like, we just process them like all the other requests. So I really found it fascinating, and it changed my thinking completely. And I think it's a natural extension of the subcommittee on proactive disclosures work, right? Because one of the things that we looked at, if everyone has a copy of the report, was this idea of personas, as I think is what we identified them as, is could we identify that throughout the government? And here, I think you kind of laid the groundwork or a map on how we could do this work and actually affect and incentivize the FOIA offices. Because with commercial requesters, if you're processing 90% of the FOIA requests, if you can get it out of your lane, it is in your interest to identify those records as for proactive releases. Now, obviously, the work's going to have to be done at least one time, and I think EPA might be a really good model to look at to see what you're doing for the next committee. So I want to really thank you for your work, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it as well. At this time, I'd like to turn to the members of the audience. I know we had some hands going up. So for the next 5 minutes, we'll take comments and questions from the folks in attendance. You may address your comments or questions to the committee as well as to Professor Kwakwa. I invite those of you with questions or comments to approach the microphone, and for the record, please state your name and your organization.
I'm Sarah Kotler. I'm the director of the FOIA program at the Food and Drug Administration. So you've got questions and I've got answers. First, I want to thank Professor Kwakwa. I remember speaking with you when you were making your FOIA requests, and I really enjoyed your presentation and your article, although with respect to FDA, I didn't read anything that was surprising to me. It was still very interesting just to read an article about the workload at federal agencies and not just talking about what a bad job we're doing. So I did appreciate that part of it. And just for you, for the future, I would love for you to do some research on commercial requesters who are using FOIA for civil discovery. That is a very big part of what we do at the FDA, in addition to corporate espionage and the resellers. I just wanted to cover 2 points, and one is about the logs, and one is about the 483s. So to your point, Mr. Zaid, FDA issues about 10 to 12,000 483s every year for inspections, foreign and domestic. At most, I would say we get requests for 25 to 30% of those. So any effort to say, let's just redact them all before anyone, and post them before anyone asks for them, is probably not the best use of our resources. We are very strict about posting any 483s where we do get 3 or more requests on ORA's webpage, that's the Office of Regulatory Administration, and also when we even expect that we will get a lot of requests. We have published on our website every single pharmacy compounding 483 since the meningitis outbreak in 2012. This is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of 483s that have been proactively posted before we've gotten a single FOIA request. So I really do think that considering these are relatively simple requests that pretty much always get answered in 20 days or less anyway, we're doing about as good a job as we can on the 483s without doing more affirmative posting. With respect to the log, as much as it is a good common sense argument, well, if the FDA wasn't spending so much time handing out copies of this log, they could be handling these complicated requests from Bloomberg. Unfortunately, in practice, it doesn't really work that way, because the one person who's a grade 8 in my office and spends 4 hours a month responding to these requests for the log isn't really in a position to make a contribution to that request from Bloomberg. The output of actual time is extremely minimal. And we are actually looking into posting it. We've looked for a while. There are some pros and cons to doing it. One of the cons being that, as you know, about 12 of our requests come from consumers. And because of the way they write the requests, we do sometimes have to protect their identity. And once you're going to start putting that kind of information on the website, the safest thing, and what most agencies like NIH have done, is they've taken the requester name off. They just really post the date that the agency got it and what the request was for. But the requesters we get, they won't be happy with that. And they're going to come in and make their requests anyway. So I think we would be spending time to post some version of the log that would be the safest to post and not potentially put us in a privacy situation with accidentally releasing someone's identity, and it wouldn't really make these requesters who come in and ask for our log all that satisfied, and I think we'd then be posting it and answering FOIA requests for it. So that's the analysis that we've done at FDA.
because I thought Mark's comments were really, his questions were great, and it was fabulous to have you right here to give the answers. It really helps fill out the picture.
Hi. Hello, my name is Michael Ravnitsky. I'm speaking as a private individual. I thought the presentation was very interesting. I haven't read the paper, so my comments should be interpreted in that light. And I thought the FDA representative's comments were also very interesting because it shows that government is sometimes smarter than we give it credit for, that where there are situations where it can be efficiently transferred to a non-FOIA function and a proactive release, often that's done, and what we're seeing is sometimes the borderline cases or the cases where it might not quite pay to do it, although it might advance transparency to move past that barricade. So I think we have to be aware of the fallacy that assuming these phenomena that you've identified in your paper are somehow new. Many of them have been going on for years. For example, FDA was in the forefront. They were among the first to publish FOIA case logs on microfiche because the demand was there. And from there, the interest in FOIA case logs as a tool spread to other agencies. But they were doing this for decades. And I agree with the overall conclusions, but there, as you acknowledge, to some degree, there is value in these commercial requests. I think I don't agree with the characterization of the cost of these things, and I think the public value was understated in some of your conclusions. The tendency is to bash commercial requests, but commercial requesters perform valuable ancillary functions. They break free valuable data that's underutilized. It results in more public-private use often. It encourages more accurate, user-friendly data sets in the agency if the agency keeps getting asked for the same thing over and over again. It improves government efficiency internally when these data sets are requested and these data are individually requested. This wouldn't happen unless the commercial marketplace did identify value there, and so commercial requesters often use this technique as a way of overcoming the lack of practical alternatives and access to these data. So in some sense, the commercial requesters might be perceived to some degree as creating public value, and the public good is articulable and measurable, and this dollar value of improving the public marketplace of information, I think that shouldn't be overlooked. Commercial requests may require less referrals, for example, so they may be less expensive to process in some sense than other types of requests. There may be consultation needed with the original supplier of data to the agency, but I think the process is rather streamlined. The profile of requests by an agency is a little more nuanced, I think, than you gave credence in your presentation. The agencies are very different. Some have enormous amounts of commercial requests, others have very few. And to say commercial requesters are sort of taking over the FOIA process is, I think, misleading, because the vast majority of requests are things like immigration records and customs records and citizenship and things like that, where they've been placed into that category artificially by the government agencies, but they're not really FOIA requests in the sense that they originally were intended. Whereas the commercial requesters were built into the process from the very get-go. They pay full fees. They may not cover all the costs, of course, but they do. It is envisioned that there will be commercial requesters, and those are anticipated in the statute. And look at where's the shortfall that you identify in this. Where exactly is that coming about? Should the agencies look more carefully at the costs of processing requests and try to better capture that, because they are supposed to capture the full review, search, duplication costs that are being assessed, and if they're not, for some reason, if there's a massive shortfall, then those locations might be identified and helped. Wouldn't agencies have expended some of those resources anyway, even without the commercial requesters coming to them? And could release to one, release to all help address this problem? This was discussed a little bit, but further release could help diffuse the concentration of information in particular locations. These businesses that do this are only doing it because the agencies themselves are keeping the information to themselves. That could be defeated very easily just by making it more available, and not randomly available by searching, by putting in keyword searches, but actually curating the information in a well-established way. These agencies provide a lot of added value by indexing and metadata and making it possible to browse data. What is this company doing, for example? Whereas a lot of the information provided, such as on FOIA Online, you can only do by random searches, which may or may not capture what you're looking for. So I would say, could agencies be considered complicit in the alleged commercial requester problem? And I have a couple of further comments. Dumping records online without a structure or browsing is not really very useful. The agencies have done some things with their reading rooms, but some agencies have put stuff online without any random rhyme or reason to it, and it makes it very hard to find anything. I was going to name names, but I won't. I think it requires a librarianship function, a curatorial function online, which is sorely missing in a lot of places. Having things arranged so that you can browse as well as search randomly. Overall, the commercial request portfolio is valuable to the agencies also because it tells the agencies which record sets are of the greatest interest and value to the public marketplace. One of the functions of government is to reduce hurdles, unnecessary hurdles, and encourage development of the commercial marketplace. An important goal of this committee should be to encourage the movement of routinizable requests out of the FOIA into proactive release, as the presenter discussed. And finally, perhaps the chief FOIA, there was some discussion that the FOIA officers themselves and the FOIA units do not necessarily tell the agencies what to do at the outset of the records development, which would be the most useful place to put this kind of thing. Perhaps the chief FOIA officer, which takes a broader role in the agency, could be a productive channel for establishing changes in the front end, handling and pre-processing of frequently requested routinizable records.
Thank you.
It was Mr. Ravinsky, was that it? Yeah, so I think actually, we may differ on some marginal questions, but we largely agree fundamentally. I actually think that, commercial requesting is in fact adding various kinds of value to the system, and one of the values that I think we should get from it is that the marketplace is determining what information would be best to prioritize in terms of affirmative disclosure regimes. I think to that end, we could even decide, as Ms. Kotler said, only 25 or 30% of 483s are requested. Well, we could make a decision in some of these instances to say, well, even if that's true, we're going to go for it and try to publish them all for a while and see what starts to happen, right? To do some experimentation and say, would various other unanticipated benefits come, even if we spend a little bit more on the front end than we would by doing these one by one. If it's not just like a purely cost-benefit analysis, I think that'd be worth thinking about. And I think commercial enterprises are doing exactly what you suggest, right? So are identifying where records hold value in the private marketplace. And so I don't actually mean to malign them. I mean to say that to the extent that we can easily identify what those information needs are, we should meet them in a way that makes more sense than the one-by-one requesting, at least in my mind, that is currently going on. And that I think that would have other kinds of benefits as well, both for the requesting process and for the public at large. Now, some of your points I think are entirely valid and don't have good empirical answers right now, right? So are commercial requests simply so routine that we can kind of fly through them, and so they actually cost very little for us to do? Agencies don't account, as far as I know. I couldn't find any agency that accounts for the cost, the kind of total cost that they incur for each request. The fees charged, yes, but not the cost side, right? So I couldn't really disaggregate like costs attributed to commercial enterprise versus other types of requesters. Where does that shortfall come from? Again, I'm not 100% sure, right? Some of it may be the fact that the law provides that if it's more costly to recoup the fees than the amount of fees charged, then you shouldn't charge anything at all. Lots of agencies have kind of a dollar cutoff, 20 or sometimes even higher dollars, right? That they just won't charge any fee below that. If you have hundreds of requests, but each is for a few page record, right, then you may end up in that kind of situation where each individual request is simply just doesn't meet the threshold. Through no fault of the commercial requesters, I don't suggest that they're gaming the process. They're doing exactly what the law prescribes. I mean only to suggest that, to the extent that we can identify this as not the best way of handling this kind of information need. And as you suggest, if we were to do affirmative disclosure, then we wouldn't have kind of this reselling industry as to some of these records, because it would simply be available for everyone. And all of the technology issues that you mentioned, including kind of searchability and usability of the data that's posted, I think are absolutely central to any initiative to that end. So I appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
So it's my hope that during the next committee term that we will address some of these questions that have been brought up. I think this is a good point, a good stopping point for that, the proactive subcommittee, proactive disclosure. Thank you again.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Okay, so we'll now pause for a short break, and then we'll resume in about 10 minutes. So we have 11:20, so at 11:30. Please feel free to visit the Charters Cafe and the restrooms on the ground floor, which is 2 levels down. Thank you.